purpose of the Flick-Reedy Education Enterprises is to promote individual moral responsibility through education. How do we do this? We study and discuss the interrelationships of history, philosophy, social studies, and economics. We do not dictate. We do not make statements as to what we think you should or should not do. We do not unduly burden this program with footnotes, references, or complete documentation. However, we do give sufficient data to bring this discussion into proper focus. We invite you to delve further into the necessary historical and statistical data to develop a deeper understanding of truth and a keener sense of individual moral responsibility.
As we begin these final 4 parts of the Two Worlds, I'd like to review briefly what has been covered in terms of questions which I hope were raised in your mind and for which I hope you're getting your own answers, plus bits of specific information which I hope you are verifying for accuracy to your own satisfaction. In Part 1, the question was raised as to whether there was a connection between the material wealth and abundance of our nation and the degree of individual freedom which we have enjoyed. We suggested, you recall, that the material wealth and abundance were but fringe benefits to the great spirituality of life with individual freedom. The short, one-sentence summary of that part was simply, individual freedom is the mainspring of human progress. It was stated that to retain individual freedom, man must assume an equal amount of individual responsibility, and that freedom without responsibility degenerates into license, which leads to chaos and anarchy. In Part 2, we compared the two worlds of regimentation and freedom by looking at 6 paired concepts, which were reliance and responsibility, talents and reward, possession and land, justice and control, virtue and respect, and finally, you, man, and your individuality. With freedom, reliance and responsibility is put on the individual. You tend to work hard, become prudent, resourceful, thrifty. Under regimentation, the state takes over reliance and responsibility. Man tends to give up trying to grow more, produce more, and as a result, relies more and more on the state. With freedom, talents are encouraged. Reward is obtained by the value your fellow man places on your services to him. Therefore, you develop your God-given talents to better serve your fellow man, obtain the reward that comes from him. Under regimentation, talents are restricted to fit state plans. Reward is given by the state, not your fellow man. Man's talents lie dormant and underdeveloped. Man works to please the state, to avoid punishment. With freedom, the idea of private property is respected and protected by the state. You seek to acquire property as a means of comfort and to become self-reliant. Under regimentation, possessions and land are owned or controlled by the state. Man has little incentive. He just tries to stay alive. With freedom, justice is equal for all by law, constant and impartial. Control is primarily by self-discipline. You act with assurance, can predict the results of your actions. Under regimentation, justice is a variable to serve the interests of the state. Control is mainly external, through force and fear of force by the state. With freedom, virtue is taught as a divine rule. Respect is encouraged in self, then others. You recognize your creation in the spiritual image of God. You act to attain self-respect, then accord it to others where merited. Under regimentation, materialism tends to be more important than God. God is often denied entirely. Respect exists only for the state. Man obeys state through fear, does not respect self or fellow man. With freedom, you, man, are considered to have both body and soul, a divine creation. Your individuality is recognized and respected by both state and fellow man. You tend to act to reflect your divine creation, giving regard and concern to your fellow man as an individual. Under regimentation, man is considered nothing more than physical matter in motion, an animal. Individuality is not tolerated by the state. So, man tends to be animal-like. Moral considerations are unimportant. Man yields to state mold in order to survive. He becomes a mere number in the masses. Now we begin to understand why freedom has produced our wonderful way of life, and how regimentation has produced starvation, poverty, and moral decay. Both results are merely the logical extension of man's reaction to the external climate in which he lives. Following the two worlds comparison, we reviewed the rise and fall of 9 of the greatest civilizations of early times, from Babylon to Rome. We were looking to see if we could determine what caused them to fall, and if by so learning we might better be able to prevent the same thing from happening to our own country and civilization. 3 basic causes were suggested as common to the fall of all of these great civilizations. These 3 basic causes were moral decay, economic decay, and political decay. And in each case, regimentation followed closely to fill in the vacuum created by the lack of individual moral responsibility. Following our analysis of the rise and fall of nations, we considered that there are only 2 basic forms of government, one that results from the philosophy of regimentation, and one, like our own, that results from the philosophy of freedom of the individual. It was recalled that governments of regimentation had existed under many different names, and the rulers were called by different names, such as Pharaoh, Caesar, Emperor, King, Führer, Dictator. But they all had one thing in common. Any rights the people had were given to them by Mr. Big on top. At various times in history, the people enjoyed the rights and liberties given to them by their rulers. Some of the Mr. Bigs had been lenient and considerate, but the freedoms and liberties of the people were usually rather short-lived. It was only when our own government was created that there existed the possibility for the freedoms and liberties of the people to be perpetuated. Then we looked further into our American way of life. We began with the study of Jamestown and Plymouth. We saw how, in both these early colonies, a communal or collectivistic form of political economics was attempted, and how both colonies nearly starved to death. It was only when they changed to the concepts of private property and self-reliance that they began to prosper. We touched only lightly on the period from Jamestown and Plymouth to 1776, showing the spirit and inclination of the colonists for independence, and how that finally flamed into rebellion against England and King George. In reviewing the Declaration of Independence, we went beyond its stirring preamble to look at some of the 28 specific complaints against King George and the British government, concluding with,
"And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor."
Not attempting to cover even the important battles and events, we proceeded to the first document which was to formally govern the 13 colonies after declaring their independence, the Articles of Confederation. Evidence was offered as to why this document, created by the Continental Congress, proved too weak to meet the needs of our new central government. We sought to find out why it had been created that way. We examined the fears of the people and sovereign states, which gave rise to insufficient powers for the national government. We touched on the fact that the first proposed Constitutional Convention, scheduled to be held in the fall of 1786 at Annapolis, Maryland, failed, due to a lack of quorum from the 13 states, and that it had to be put over to the spring of the next year, 1787, to be held in Philadelphia. Much emphasis was placed on the necessity of the citizens of today and tomorrow understanding the form of government the Founding Fathers gave us, to know exactly what we started with and why. Only then can we evaluate possible changes to the basic principles on which it was founded. Therefore, considerable time and attention was given to what was in the mind of the convention delegates, their hopes, their background, and their fears. Interesting side notes and stories were included to provide a keener understanding of their feelings, which were to govern the most important question: how much more power is to be given to the central government than existed in the Articles of Confederation. The importance of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, was related as the condition upon which ratification was achieved. We read the little-known preamble to the Bill of Rights to gain further understanding of the fears and concerns of the colonists as to the central government. Now that we have a better knowledge of exactly what we started with in our form of government, the what and why and how, we can not only appreciate it, we can be for something instead of against something. We have the section of George Washington's farewell address as a guide to how we should change our Constitution, if we indeed want to change it. With this background, we conducted a 4-part study of communism. We started with its history and growth from 40,000 followers of Lenin in 1917 to communism's control of about 1/3 of all the people on the earth today. In their own words, communists strive for the control of the whole world, by any means it takes to accomplish their goal, whether it be lies, deceit, mass murder, starvation, anything, so long as it advances the cause of communism. Some basic points of their philosophy, namely atheism, dialectical materialism, and economic determinism, were reduced to our everyday language. Note was taken of the communists' perversion of the meaning of words. For example, peace to us means one thing. To the communists, it means the end of all resistance to communism. History was reviewed up to the present to see if the ravings of the madman Lenin were indeed mere ravings.
First, we shall take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like an overripe fruit into our hands.
We took a close-up look at some of the deceitful appeals of communism, as well as several instances showing their faulty reasoning, particularly their idea of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. The catch to this idea is that it is the communist leaders who are going to decide who has what ability and what a person's needs are, not the individual. Turning to Marx's book, The Communist Manifesto, we reviewed several of the key thoughts: abolition of private property, abolition of the family, abolition of religion, and how they were going to achieve these by Marx's 10-point formula. While being against communism in our United States is akin to being against sin and for motherhood, it was necessary to consider the ideological blood brother of communism, modern socialism. This was done in the next 4 parts. We showed that modern socialism began from Marx's Communist Manifesto, and that Marx and the communist leaders since him used the terms communism and socialism interchangeably. We traced the history of modern socialism from the Manifesto, through Fabian socialism in England, Italian socialism under Mussolini called fascism, German socialism under Hitler called Nazism, and the socialism here in our own United States, from Eugene Debs to the present. While all communists are socialists, it was pointed out that according to some socialists, all socialists are not communists. These socialists profess religious beliefs and disclaim the atheism of the communists. They also disclaim the terrorism, force, and brutality of the communists. But nowhere do they differ from the long-range goals of complete state ownership and control over people and economics. To show the socialistic trends in our country, we investigated voting index materials by two organizations, Americans for Democratic Action, ADA, and Americans for Constitutional Action, ACA, showing that each of them did a good job of reflecting how senators and representatives in Congress voted in accordance with their respective and differing philosophies. Starting with Part 17, we looked at our economic system, capitalism, where the term came from and what it actually means. We interpreted the formula, man's material welfare equals natural resources plus human energy, multiplied by tools. The following is an extract from a recent book by Norman Vincent Peale, a noted theologian of our times. Consider his observations on spending, debt, and the enticement which tends to create spending and debt.
Back in 1910, the population of this country was about 90 million. The cost of running the federal government was about $1 billion, and the national debt was $1 billion. Today our population has doubled, but the cost of running our government is around $100 billion, and the national debt is over $300 billion. In other words, forgetting inflation for the moment, it is costing us 100 times as much to govern twice as many people as it did half a century ago. And we owe 300 times as much as we did then. In the long run, this may not be as damaging to the soul of America as the relentless pressure that big money in Washington exerts, both on those who disperse it and those who receive it. If the government is costing us over $100 billion per year, this means that every week close to $2 billion is being spent somewhere. A state of affairs that tends to create an ever-increasing horde of official donors on the one hand, and a too dependent class of citizens on the other. You don't have to be a political expert, or even very interested in politics, to see that under these circumstances, the pressures on individual congressmen become enormous. On the one hand, his constituents back home are urging him to grab what he can from the public trough, and threatening to withhold their votes from him unless he does. Meantime, in Washington, any administration that controls the spending has a ready-made device for bribing him into voting the way they want him to vote.
Having thus reviewed what was covered in the previous 20 parts, we shall next consider the nature of the responsibility of citizenship and some suggestions toward acceptance of that responsibility.